It started with a silence I'd grown too used to. My husband, Matt, had become more of a roommate than a partner. We'd sit at the dinner table, scrolling through our phones, barely exchanging more than a few words. It had been 7 months since he last touched me in a way that felt intimate. Not sexually, intimately. Like he saw me. Like he wanted me. I tried to rationalize it. Work stress, exhaustion, routines. But the excuses started feeling like lies I told myself to avoid facing the truth. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who looked outside her marriage. I used to hear stories of infidelity and judge them harshly. If you're not happy, just leave, I'd say. It's never that simple. The heart doesn't shatter in a single moment. It erodes over time, until one day you realize you're lonely while sitting right next to the person you vowed to spend your life with. I found him in a Reddit book forum, of all places. We were both commenting on the same thread about a novel I love. His responses were sharp, insightful. Witty. I replied. He responded back. Before I knew it, we were exchanging messages daily. His name was David. He was 55, divorced, with grown kids and a calmness that settled into his words like aged wine. I'm 36. At first, it felt silly. But he never flirted in the way younger men did. He asked about my opinions. Remembered little details I mentioned days earlier. Told me my thoughts had weight. He never pried about my marriage, but he didn't need to. I shared things voluntarily. The cold bed. The mechanical conversations. The sense that I'd vanish inside my own life. He told me he understood. That he'd lived through something similar. And then, in one message, he said, "You deserve to feel alive again." It wasn't the words that got me, it was how much I needed to hear them. I started waiting for his messages like a teenager. At work. In bed. Sometimes I'd read our old chats, smiling like an idiot. My body, unused to attention, started reacting. A blush here. A shiver there. I'd forgotten how good it felt to be wanted even from a distance. I told myself it was harmless. Just someone to talk to. But then came the photo. He sent a picture of himself, nothing provocative, just him in his kitchen, cooking. Salt and pepper beard, sleeves rolled up, warm smile. And then he added, "If we ever met, I'd cook for you." That night, I stared at my reflection in the mirror longer than usual. I changed my part. Wore perfume to work. Not for Matt, he wouldn't have noticed, but for the woman I'd lost somewhere between the grocery lists and laundry loads. David made me feel seen. I didn't know how much I missed that until I had it again. Things with Matt didn't improve. He was working later, always tired. When I hinted we needed to talk, he brushed it off. Once, I stood in front of him in lingerie I hadn't worn since our honeymoon. He looked up from his laptop and said, "You okay?" That was the moment something inside me cracked. David and I started calling each other. Late-night conversations that went beyond books. He had this voice, smooth, deep, calm. I would sit in the dark, phone pressed to my cheek, just listening to him talk about his garden, his regrets, the way his ex-wife once made blueberry muffins every Sunday. He made ordinary things sound sacred. I hung on every word. He asked once, casually, where I live. I told him. Turned out we were only 30 minutes apart. I laughed nervously, saying, "Small world." He replied, "Maybe not a coincidence." The idea of meeting in person hung in the air for weeks. Unspoken, but there. We both danced around it until one evening, he said, "I could come over sometime. Just to talk. If you want." My pulse thudded. I didn't say yes right away. But I didn't say no. I told myself it was still innocent. That I'd never cross a line. But I spent the entire next day deep cleaning the house, cooking, lighting a candle I hadn't touched in a year. I picked out a dress I usually save for dinners out. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I didn't see a married woman preparing to cheat. I saw someone desperate to feel something again. I told Matt I was having a girls' night. He nodded without asking questions. That hurt more than I expected. I wanted him to stop me. To look up and say, "Don't go." But he didn't even glance up. When David texted that he was on his way, I felt like I was about to do something irreversible. I paced the living room, poured wine, changed my lipstick twice. When the doorbell rang, I froze. Every cell in my body screamed, "You don't have to do this." But I walked to the door anyway. And there he was. Real. Taller than I imagined. Rugged, with that same quiet smile. He held a bottle of red wine in one hand and a pie in the other. "I thought dessert might sweeten the deal," he joked. I laughed. It came out shaky. We sat in the kitchen. Talked. Drank. Ate. Nothing dramatic happened, not at first. But the air between us was charged. Every glance lingered a second too long. Every brush of fingers sent a ripple through my skin. He looked around and said, "This place feels like you." And I, absurdly touched, said thank you. No one had complimented my space in years. At one point, I reached across the table for the wine and our hands touched. Neither of us moved. "You're beautiful," he said. Just like that. No game, no build-up. I didn't know what to say. No one had called me that in years. I felt my throat tighten. He leaned in, slow enough for me to pull away. I didn't. And I wish I could say I stopped it there. That I remembered my vows. That I thought about Matt. But all I thought about in that moment was how long it had been since someone looked at me like they wanted to kiss me. So I let him. One kiss. Soft. Then another, deeper. The kind that pulls your whole body into it. I didn't think. I just felt. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear the music anymore. I don't remember how we moved from the kitchen to the couch. Or how the wine glasses ended up on the floor. But I remember the way he touched me, like I was something precious. Like he'd been waiting years just to hold me like this. And I remember thinking, this is what I've been missing. This is what I used to feel. Afterward, the silence returned. But it was different now. Not empty, just heavy. He asked if I was okay. I nodded. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. Just still. Like I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't undo. He left with a kiss on the cheek and a whispered, "Text me when you're ready to talk." I locked the door and stood in the hallway for a long time. The air still smelled like his cologne. My reflection caught me in the mirror, and for the first time in years, I didn't recognize the woman staring back. And the worst part? I didn't feel regret. Not yet. When I messaged him the next morning, it wasn't to apologize. It was to ask if he got home safe. He said yes, and added, "Last night felt real." That word stuck with me. Real? Because everything else in my life felt staged, forced smiles, dull routines, robotic conversations. What happened between us was the first thing in a long time that didn't feel fake. I didn't see him for a week. Not because I didn't want to, I thought about it constantly, but because I was afraid of what it meant to want him again. I kept going over that night in my head, dissecting every word, every touch, trying to figure out what line I'd crossed, or if the line had ever really existed. I'd kissed a man who wasn't my husband. I'd wanted it. I hadn't been drunk. I hadn't been coerced. I chose it. That truth was sharp and cold and impossible to outrun. Matt didn't notice anything different. He came home late, showered, went to bed. We barely exchanged 5 sentences a day. I watched him sometimes, wondering how we got so far apart without realizing it. I had spent so long begging for scraps of attention, affection, validation. One night with David had filled a void Matt hadn't even acknowledged. When David texted, "Can I see you again?" I didn't hesitate this time. I said yes. Not maybe. Not later. Just yes. We set a time. A day when Matt would be gone for a conference. I didn't even feel nervous. That's what scared me most. I wasn't overthinking anymore. I was moving forward. I cleaned again. Not for him, for me. I lit candles. I wore a soft black dress I used to save for anniversaries. I wasn't preparing for a hookup. I was preparing for something deeper, though I couldn't name it at the time. When he walked in, he kissed me right away. There was no pause, no awkwardness. Our bodies remembered. The space between us was gone like it had never been there. We talked, but only briefly because this time, words weren't needed. The tension was already burning. I thought it would feel rushed, like stolen time. But it didn't. It was slow, deliberate, full of small moments that made it worse, better. He moved like someone who knew what it meant to be careful, like he'd learned that intimacy was about attention, not speed. Every touch was intentional. Every look was a question, "Are you still here?" And I was. Fully. There was no guilt, not in those hours. I didn't think about Matt, or marriage, or vows. I thought about how his hand fit on the curve of my hip, how he whispered my name like it meant something, how I felt like I'd been holding my breath for years and finally exhaled. Afterward, we lay in silence again. He stroked my hair, tracing lines down my arm. I told him I didn't want to talk about what this meant. Not yet. He nodded. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. That scared me more than anything else. I wasn't sure I wanted him to stay. I just didn't want him to leave before I understood what I needed. Over the next month, we saw each other 3 more times. Always at my house. Always during gaps when Matt was away or occupied. I became skilled at timing everything, deleting texts, covering tracks, manufacturing excuses. It felt like living 2 lives, but one of them finally felt alive. David never pressured. He never made demands. He brought wine, food, stories. He'd lived a whole life before me, one with heartbreak and failures and wisdom I hadn't yet earned. Being with him made me feel grown in ways I didn't expect. He listened. Not the kind of polite nodding Matt had mastered, but real listening. He remembered everything I said. He noticed when I changed my hair, when I was tired, when I faked a laugh. Once, I asked him what he wanted from this. His answer was simple: "Whatever you're willing to give." That should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Because I didn't know how much I had left to give. I started pulling away from Matt even more. Not just emotionally, physically. I avoided eye contact. I slept facing the other way. He never asked why. Maybe he didn't care. Or maybe he didn't want to know. One night he tried to initiate sex. I panicked. I made up a headache. He rolled over without a word. That silence was worse than yelling. I began comparing everything. David remembered how I took my coffee. Matt forgot my birthday until his calendar reminded him. David touched me like he'd been waiting to, like he was grateful. Matt touched me like it was routine. I hated that I was keeping secrets. But I hated more that being faithful had become meaningless when intimacy no longer existed. My best friend started noticing changes. She asked if I was okay. Said I seemed distracted. Lighter, even. I dodged the question. Laughed it off. But the truth was, I wasn't lighter. I was heavier, with guilt, desire, confusion. With the weight of choices I hadn't planned to make. Then came the message I didn't expect. David said, "I think about you when I wake up." That scares me. He'd crossed his own line. This wasn't casual for him anymore. And for a moment, I panicked. I had opened a door I wasn't ready to walk through. I wasn't leaving Matt. I hadn't planned that far. But David had started imagining a life where I did. And I had no answers. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I'd ended up here. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't trapped. I had chosen this. I had wanted it. But now I was standing in a place where every direction came with a cost. David texted less the following week. Shorter replies. Delayed responses. I knew what was happening. He was protecting himself. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt abandoned. I sent him a message late one night. Just 3 words, "Do you miss me?" He replied 2 hours later, "Every time I close my eyes." I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just stared at the screen, feeling everything and nothing all at once. I realized then that it wasn't about David. Not really. It was about what he represented. Freedom. Attention. Desire. Escape. All the things I used to feel before my life narrowed into a box of responsibilities and routines. But escape always comes with a cost. And the walls were getting closer. The shift didn't happen all at once. It was slow, like fog rolling in unnoticed until everything was muted. David started pulling away, subtly at first. Fewer messages. Less warmth in his tone. I told myself he was busy. I even gave him space, thinking maybe I had pushed too much, needed too much. But the truth sat heavy in my chest, he was distancing himself. When I finally asked, he was honest. He said he was catching feelings he didn't know how to manage. That he felt guilty. That he respected me too much to be the reason I broke something I might still want to fix. I read his message over and over. It wasn't a goodbye, but it felt like one. I didn't respond right away. I stared at my phone, numb. Not because I didn't care, but because I did more than I expected. He had become the only space in my life that felt real. The thought of losing him was like being dropped back into the silence I'd fought so hard to escape. When I finally replied, I told him I understood. That I appreciated his honesty. That I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel the same things. But I also said I wasn't ready to talk about endings. He didn't respond. That silence hit differently. It wasn't the quiet I was used to from Matt. This one came after fire. After laughter, desire, tenderness. It felt like something had been yanked away mid-sentence. I tried to go back to my routine. Pretend nothing had changed. Wake up, make breakfast, go to work, come home. Smile when necessary. But the hollowness echoed louder now. I had experienced what it felt like to be seen, touched, chosen, and now I was back to being invisible. Matt remained oblivious. Or maybe he knew and didn't want to confront it. He started asking fewer questions, as if sensing something was wrong but choosing comfort over truth. One evening, he suggested we go away for the weekend. It caught me off guard. I agreed, not because I wanted to fix anything, but because I didn't want to deal with confrontation. We went. We stayed at a small hotel by the coast. We walked, ate, talked like acquaintances. The trip was bland. Unmemorable. He tried to initiate sex again, and I gave in, partly out of guilt, partly out of pity. But the disconnect was undeniable. I felt nothing. I stared at the ceiling afterward, empty. That night, I checked my phone in the bathroom, hoping, irrationally, that David had messaged. Nothing. When we returned, I found myself back in the cycle of pretending. I hated it more now. The absence of David made me feel like I had lost something irreplaceable, not because he was perfect, but because he had reminded me who I used to be before I stopped demanding more from life. 3 days later, I broke. I messaged him again, a simple, raw sentence, "Can we talk?" He replied the next day. "Are you sure?" We met the following evening, not at my house this time, but somewhere neutral. The energy between us was tense. He looked tired, guarded. I asked if he hated me. He shook his head and said, "I wish I could." I asked if he wanted to end this. He said he didn't know. I told him I wasn't ready to give this up. That I didn't want to go back to who I was before him. That I wasn't pretending my marriage was fine anymore. He said, "Then you have a decision to make." I went home with those words ringing in my head. It wasn't about choosing between two men. It was about choosing the version of myself I wanted to live with. The one who stayed out of fear and obligation, or the one who risked pain for truth. I had spent years convincing myself I was doing the right thing by staying. But staying had become its own kind of betrayal. Over the next week, I did a lot of thinking. No more hiding. No more avoidance. I stopped checking David's messages constantly. I stopped hoping for some grand romantic gesture to fix everything. Instead, I sat with the discomfort. I asked myself hard questions. Matt noticed something different. One night, he looked at me across the table and said, "You've been somewhere else lately." I didn't deny it. I just nodded. He asked if there was someone else. I said yes. The silence that followed was heavier than anything we'd ever shared. He looked away, jaw tight, eyes blank. I expected yelling. Accusations. But he just said, "I knew something was wrong." I didn't want to believe it. I didn't offer excuses. I didn't cry. I told him the truth, not just about David, but about how long I'd felt alone, how long I'd been begging for connection without saying the words. I told him I was sorry, but also that I couldn't keep living a half-life. That it wasn't just about infidelity, it was about slowly dying inside a marriage that had become a shell. He didn't ask for details. He didn't want to know everything. He just said, "So what now?" I said I needed space. Time to figure out what life looked like without lying to myself. He agreed to give me that. Not kindly, but quietly. That silence, for once, felt like acknowledgement. I didn't run to David after that. I didn't show up at his door expecting comfort. I took a few days to sit alone in the wreckage of everything I'd avoided. I stopped pretending to be the perfect wife. I stopped trying to fix something that neither of us had watered in years. Then, one night, David messaged me. "How are you, really?" I replied, honest. Finally. He asked if he could see me. I didn't answer right away. This time, it wasn't about escaping. It wasn't about filling a void. It was about choosing to be awake. To feel. To stop silencing the parts of myself that had been screaming for years. I didn't know what the future looked like. I didn't know if David would be a chapter or the rest of the story. But I knew I was done living a lie. I knew I wanted to live a life that was full, not just of people, but of truth, intimacy, and presence. So I messaged back. Yes. David didn't respond right away. A full day passed before he replied, tomorrow. My place. If you're sure. I stared at those words longer than necessary, not because I was uncertain, but because I finally wasn't. I had been living in hesitation for too long, measuring my steps against guilt, consequence, and fantasy. Now, everything was settled inside me. Not tidy. Not painless. But clear. When I arrived, he opened the door with that same quiet intensity one remembered. There was no performance. No overcompensating. Just two people who had crossed a line and had come back not for drama or thrill, but for something that felt dangerously close to real commitment. We didn't talk much at first. There was too much weight between us. Not tension, just the unspoken acknowledgement that this wasn't just about stolen hours anymore. This was about what came next. Eventually, I told him everything. That Matt knew. That I hadn't left yet, but I had left emotionally a long time ago. That I wasn't asking him to save me or to be the next thing I clung to. I needed him to understand I wasn't trading one dependency for another. He didn't react right away. He listened. Fully. Like he always had. Then he said, I'm not here to catch you. I'm here if you walk on your own. That response cracked something open in me. It was the first time I'd felt trusted to be my own person, not just someone's wife or lover or role. Over the next few weeks, I began the process of untangling my life from Matt's. It wasn't as explosive as I expected. There were no dramatic fights, no thrown objects, no scenes. Just the slow disassembly of years of habit. We sat down and discussed logistics, who would move out, what to do with the house, how to handle the narrative. He asked if I loved David. I said I didn't know yet. But I knew I couldn't keep pretending in our marriage. He accepted it with the expression of someone who had seen it coming and just hoped it wouldn't be true. I gave him the respect of truth. He gave me the grace of not making it harder than it already was. That was the first real kindness we'd shared in a long time. David and I didn't rush into anything official. He didn't ask me to move in. I didn't push for promises. What we had was an open space where honesty lived. We talked more now, deeply, plainly, vulnerably. Not every moment was romantic. Sometimes it was hard. Sometimes it was awkward. But it was real. I learned how to be alone again. To sit with silence without feeling like something was missing. To go a day without seeking external validation. I went to therapy. I stopped pretending I was fine when I wasn't. I stopped justifying things that didn't feel good. I built myself a new rhythm. And David was there, not as a savior, but as a steady presence. He had his life. His routines. His space. He made room for me, but didn't fill the voids I needed to face myself. That was new for me. Uncomfortable, even. But necessary. One afternoon, I visited the house one last time to pick up the last box of my things. The bedroom was bare. The kitchen still had that faint smell of our old life, spices, dust, forgotten dinners. I stood there for a moment, not out of regret, but out of recognition. That version of me had died here. The silent woman. The one who begged in her own head for something to change but never move. When I closed the door, it wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the final step in finally living honestly. I didn't know if I had made all the right decisions. But I knew I had made them with clarity, and that was more than I could say for most of my life. A few months later, I woke up next to David and realized I hadn't thought about Matt in days. Not out of malice. Just because my present had finally stopped being overshadowed by the past. David reached for my hand, still half asleep, and mumbled something about coffee. I smiled, not because it was perfect, but because it was peaceful. Consistent. Quietly intimate in a way that required no performance. I wasn't the same woman who had invited a 55-year-old man into her house months ago looking for something she couldn't name. I had found the name. It was presence. Being chosen. Being awake. And more than anything, choosing myself, finally, without apology. Infidelity was never the whole story. It was the moment that forced me to stop lying to myself. It shattered a version of my life that looked fine on the outside but was rotting underneath. In its place, I had built something smaller, less perfect, but infinitely more honest. And if I had to choose again, knowing the mess and pain and guilt it brought, I would still choose it. Not for the man, but for the woman I became when I stopped pretending.